Welcome back to another episode of Navigating Carbon, your compass to carbon management. As always, I'm your host, Deb Ryan, and this week on the podcast, I was joined by Bryan Ross. Bryan is the Global Account Executive at Envana. Envana is an oil and gas carbon management software that helps companies track, forecast, and report their emissions across all of their global operations and through their supply chain. Bryan and I tackle all of these topics and more, really diving into some of the key challenges that companies are facing, as well as some of the challenges they're having staying on top of the ever-evolving regulatory space that they have to comply with. If you really enjoy our conversation today, please make sure you like the podcast. And if you want to stay on top of all of the upcoming episodes dealing with different aspects of the carbon management landscape, please make sure you subscribe. But for now, sit back and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Bryan. Hi, and we're back for another episode of Navigating Carbon. And today I'm joined by Bryan Ross. Bryan, welcome.
Hello, glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you. And so you're at a company called Envana. Do you want to start by just giving folks an overview of who Envana is and what you guys do in the carbon space?
Sure. Yeah, so Envana is a joint venture of Halliburton and Sigler Guff. So we're focused on delivering emissions management solutions specifically to the oil and gas industry, really going all the way down to the operational level and engaging with teams across multiple disciplines to help them build complete scope 1, 2, and 3 inventories, as well as dive in deep and understand their methane emissions.
No, that's really great. And we're going to unpack a whole bunch of that. And I think the thing that I really like about what you guys do is this concept of carbon management. Like you said, like you really have to kind of go in deep on lots of different aspects of the actual business itself. So focusing in on the oil and gas industry of this conversation is really great. And your like software kind of solution, the Envana Catalyst, there's a lot of different pieces of emissions management that it covers. So I want to kind of start with first bit, like the tracking and how you guys are thinking about emissions tracking through that. You know, not everyone is aware that emissions are actually calculated. We measure different parameters that go into emissions calculations. But can you explain, given that we have to calculate emissions, what you guys see when you work with different clients, really the value and the importance of having really good underlying data?
Yeah.
Can you kind of dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, I could totally dive into that. So I would say that the number one thing whenever we engage with new customers, and with us being associated with Halliburton, we're engaging with customers around the world. We're not stuck in just the US or just Canada. So we're speaking with like a large range of people in terms of how developed they are in their emissions management journey. And so you could have customers that are doing absolutely nothing today in terms of tracking their emissions and they just need somewhere to start. Or you could have maybe some of the more the international oil companies such as BP, Chevron, those names that have been doing this for a while and have very developed processes. And so starting with a company that is very new, before you even get into the data itself and using any kind of software platform, if that's going to be something like Envana Catalyst or even down to an Excel sheet, you have to do almost a conceptual mapping exercise of just helping them identify like what are their sources of emissions and what type of emissions will be created from those different types of sources. That's going to be based on what type of assets they have. And so if they're only an upstream provider, you're going to look at their production facilities, you're going to look at their well operations. If they're midstream, that's going to be pipelines and compressor stations. And then downstream, if it's power generation, refineries, or gas processing and LNG plants, we look at those. We identify all of the different sources of methane emissions as well as carbon emissions. We map all of those out, identify how many different pieces of equipment are located at each asset and where those are located. And then from there, you look and identify within the company's infrastructure what data is even available for us to leverage to make emission calculations.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I mean, given the broad range of, and again, working with global customers or even customers that have only got like a single operation in a certain state or something, given just the the vast and broad number of emission sources across a company's production assets, having that audit trail becomes really necessary for tracking of, say, scope one emissions and corporate disclosures and some of that kind of stuff. Can you explain, how you've kind of worked with customers or the importance you've seen in that kind of like audit trail
Yeah.
process of just this data management problem?
Totally, totally. Yeah. So I guess the step after they've identified their sources, in order to create an audit trails, they need to figure out like how they want to calculate their emissions. And so if they're a new company, that would be usually typically these publicly available methodologies. The EPA has their emission factors, the IPCC has theirs, the API compendium's got factors. GHG Brazilian Protocol offers some things as well. And so there's a variety of methods that people can use to make emission calculations. And so we, based on their data set, based on their types of assets, we offer the methodologies they could use. Then what companies will typically do is take all of those formulas, all of those emission factors, outline it in some kind of Excel sheet that they might use typically. And it's a simple math problem. You've got a formula, you've got a factor, you've got other components, those go in, and then you can make the calculation. If you're a company that has a very wide asset base, you're going to have a very wide Excel sheet with a lot of different formulas all over the place that will be redundant for different assets, but they're going to look very individual when you view it, and it makes auditing to make sure the calculations are done right very difficult. And so it's important to have some kind of software platform that allows you to apply one type of methodology to the specific data sources, view the emissions down to that individual source, and then see all of the data points and formulas that went into making that calculation. And so if you can have a program that automatically does that and allows you to say, okay, for my flaring sources at this asset, here's all of the methodologies and formulas that were used, and you can do that in one click, and someone can come in and verify that. It makes that very easy, and it reduces any risk of mismanual entry, and helps you also automate the whole process.
Yeah. Well, and the other piece of that as well, like it also, I would assume, it actually also cuts down on the risk of different teams using different data because now it's all centralized. Everyone's using the same data set instead of their own spreadsheets as well in different parts of the business. So I assume that's something you've also seen that's been a real benefit by having a centralized platform.
Totally, totally. I mean, most international companies will do different processes across the business units. And I will say though that, that's on the one hand, it's a factor of oil and gas, and a lot of times you'll have technologies different across business units. But it's also a factor of like the emissions environments, because the regulatory frameworks are different all over the world. So if you're calculating emissions for operations in Canada versus operations in the US, you actually have to calculate them differently. There's different emission factors and different methodologies used. So companies are required to basically keep two sets of books of like what their emissions are. And the fact that they have to do that actually makes it more important to have a centralized platform, so then you can view it all together and you can keep those methodologies separate and aligned for each region.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, huge complex data problem, which I think is underappreciated in the emission space for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
Um,
One
one of the
point on
things,
that, Deb,
oh,
just
yeah,
kind of on the idea of it being underappreciated. So, I mean, my background, I came from like upstream well operations, and then I got into this space, and so I was very much focused on upstream. This has allowed me to look at midstream and downstream operations as well. Emissions and kind of where it's positioned within the oil and gas industry is one of the only disciplines that's like spread across the entire value chain, like for these operators. And so the people that are involved in it need to understand like every single phase of the operation, if you're a vertically integrated operator, to have the entire picture of emissions. And so different from other types of disciplines where you can be very much upstream focused, or the other verticals, you need to be able to view the entire picture and have a program that can not only calculate emissions for like one specific set of assets in one country, but also like kind of plant different methodologies across different types of operations and verticals to give you the entire picture, and then also allow you to understand it.
I think that's such an important aspect of this conversation is, and I've had this conversation with others before as well, where emissions it's everybody's problem, right? So exactly to your point, like working across and making sure the teams are all working together, talking the same language and some of that kind of stuff is really critical. So Yeah, I love that you guys are actually doing that and seeing that through the work you're doing as well.
Yeah,
So
totally. And
it's
like
great.
the unique thing with
Yeah.
us is that since we're from the oil and gas industry, since we're associated with Halliburton, we can focus on the problem just for oil and gas, and the industry is wide enough just to do that. We don't have to try to go off and look at other industries.
Yeah. No, that's, yeah, it makes sense. And I think figuring out those solutions for, all the different industrials, oil and gas being one of them, is, focusing in on the industry. I've seen a number of different pieces where it's like trying to dive into just what goes into scope one is going to be so specific for different industries. So yeah, really getting deep into it to help the different industries figure this out is really cool. So one of the things you talked about early on was the methane piece of this. I've had other methane conversations as part of the podcast and stuff, because methane's obviously a really critical piece within the oil and gas industry. Can you talk about some of the challenges and the importance of methane as you guys have seen it for the oil and gas industry?
Yeah, totally. So I guess obviously when you look at GHG emissions, and that's what we're focused on is just GHG, kind of not really the other gases or pollutants. Obviously, the big one's carbon and methane. Carbon is going to come mostly from your fuel consumption, and then methane is going to mostly come from your leaks and fugitive emissions. And so, because of that, methane is going to be the biggest problem once you move like further downstream in the process. So, starting at production, moving to midstream, which is literally transporting the emissions from point A to point B, and then and downstream, especially kind of on LNG, where you're messing with the gases a little bit, and you have to really turn them into something. And so, like, focusing on that, the way that people in the past calculated methane emissions was also using like the generalized emission factors and publicly available methodologies to estimate kind of what their leaks and fugitive emissions might be. But what people realize is that depending on the type of operator you are and the type of equipment that you have, directly measuring and like trying to find the leaks and quantifying those leaks is a more appropriate way to calculate methane emissions. And so that's kind of what spun up the whole thing with OGMP 2.0, which is an initiative we're very aligned with that has 5 levels of compliance. It's been around since 2020, and it's allowed operators to move from levels 1 through 3, which is using those standard emission factors, to progress towards directly measuring that methane data. And so now when you directly measure the methane data, you're going to get a leak rate at a very specific time in a very specific place. But then what do you do with that? How do you visualize it? How do you understand if this has been leaking this whole time, or is it coordinated to different types of operations, or is it a kind of a one-off black swan event? So the challenge with methane emissions is identifying, okay, which assets do we need to directly measure as our most material assets? From those measurements that we make, how often do we need to make measurements? What do we do with that data? How much uncertainty do we bake into what those measurements say? Even if we catch a large leak, what does that mean for our operations? And so for companies that are trying to make the move to level 4 and 5 with OGMP 2.0, you have to have like a full LDAR plan in place. You have to have a platform that properly digests all of that methane data to bring it into one location to allow you to visualize it and learn from it. And then you need something to make some initial calculations around what those leak rates mean to your methane footprint if you're using just measurement data.
Yeah. And that for those that aren't familiar with the OGMP 2.0 framework, and you sort of outlined it, but it's really around a data quality question where number one is low data quality, going to that really high resolution data quality at level 5, which I think I would agree. We're seeing companies more and more really trying to push further up and getting that data quality, particularly as there's more methane regulations and methane specific regulations, both here in the US, but also for LNG and oil and gas imports into Europe and things like that as well. It's becoming increasingly part of the conversation of how companies are really making sure they've got that data quality as it relates to their methane picture. So yeah, it's really interesting to see that as well. So
Totally, yeah,
yeah.
and it makes the data challenge even more difficult now. So if you're a company that operates in the U.S. and you're also an OGMP 2.0 member, let's say you also have Canadian assets, so you have to use the EPA factors when you report to the EPA. You got to use the Canadian factors when you report to Canada. But now you're going to OGMP 2.0. Now you have directly measured methane data, which is going to show different measurement informed emission factors than all the other methodologies say. So now you have three different inventories of emissions that you're reporting to three different people. And then what do you put in your sustainability report that you tell everyone? It's a very difficult challenge, and but people are embarking on it, and some of the systems they're doing it in place today seem like a very manual process, and they're having to pay a lot of people and dedicate time to it.
Yeah. So let's stay on the reporting piece for a second, because you've already highlighted some of the challenges with different jurisdictions, whether it's country. Here in the US, there's different state requirements versus federal requirements and things like that. Like, how are you seeing, this landscape of reporting is constantly changing right now. Um, how are you seeing, where are you really seeing some of the challenges for your clients that, you know, as this landscape just constantly evolves right now?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, even in the U.S., where they have one of the most robust reporting processes globally, that report's now changing this year. The emission factors have changed. People don't even know what the factors have changed, and they've got to report it in March. And so people are being pushed down to the kind of very end to make the last minute changes to get their report in. So it's very much like a rush from now until March for everyone to get their EPA report in. And we've seen a similar thing going on in Canada as well. And so, like, from our perspective, the way we look at reporting is that in order to get a good report in terms of showing your emissions, showing your emission sources, you need to have an engine under the hood that's very flexible in the way that the calculations are made, and can make it very easy for you to scale across the operation. So we focus on the engine under the hood, making sure that all of your emission sources are constantly mapped, because those won't change no matter the regulations. Makes it very easy for us to configure the different emission factors that are used, and map on different types of data sets to expand and change that inventory over time. And then from there, we work with every customer individually to map that into like a customized reports based on their regulatory distribution. So we don't really take the approach of like the one-click regulatory report that has all the information into it. We focus on getting the emissions data right and then working with them to get that into the right regulatory frameworks, and maybe like a kind of CSV export of our data set that they can put into the kind of templates that some of these countries do. Because since we work with all countries globally and any customer in any jurisdiction, we have to be very flexible in how we export the data and how we help them with that regulatory submission, but not bottling ourselves and our tool into only that regulatory submission.
No, that makes sense. And I think, again, like given just like we've already talked about, there's constant, the EPA has just gone through, for those that aren't aware, they reviewed the process that they had, and it was sort of seen to be underreporting methane. So they've been looking at how to review that. But exactly to your point, like these things are constantly changing and evolving. So there has to be that flexibility and built into some of these systems as well, because we know that the frameworks that people are having to use are also being changed and flexible as well. So
Yeah.
there's a lot
And
going on.
that's very difficult for companies that, let's say if you have a company that has an internal Excel sheet that they paid a consulting company 3 years ago to make for them that they're now managing themselves. They are then going to have to update that entire Excel sheet to work with those changes of regulatory frameworks. On top of that, too, there's also legacy third-party systems that people have used for over a decade that are becoming unsupported as well. And so what we're seeing with a lot of customers that are in these high regulatory jurisdictions is they want more of some kind of partner, like a stable person in the industry that can stick with them over the next decade, deploy like a kind of futuristic cloud-based solution that can continue to adapt over time, that they can have influence on from like a co-development partnership perspective, and know that they're working with a company that's like well funded and is not going to go out of business, because this is also a very new space where there's a lot of kind of new players coming up and down all the time.
Yeah, no, it's hugely important. So one of the things that we haven't really talked about yet, but I'm curious to get your thoughts on, and how your customers and the industry is kind of looking at this, is around scope 3. So everything we've been talking about so far, really kind of scope 1, companies' actual operations, that obviously includes some of the scope 2, their electricity use for those operations, but scope 3, so people's
Mhm.
indirect emissions, combustion from their products, all this kind of stuff, brings a whole host of extra challenges and problems. Like, how are you seeing the scope 3 conversation evolving as you're working with clients around the world?
Sure. So I would say first off, the requirement to report Scope 3 coming into this year was only in place for companies that were listed on the London Stock Exchange as well as some Asian stock exchanges. Those were the only ones that required Scope 3. Recently, there was a new CSRD requirement out of the EU, so European companies now have to report Scope 3 as well. They don't really define which categories of Scope 3 you have to report, so it's more up to the companies from what we've seen on which Scope 3 categories they report, and it's on them to expand that effort. I think the most interest and challenge we've received around the Scope 3 effort is actually more on the upstream operations side, where you have a lot more vendors that are contributing to well operations. Obviously, with us coming out of Halliburton, the software was originally built, and our entire company was originally built to support service providers. Halliburton uses our people and our tools today to calculate all of their emissions across their global operations. And so the system was set up to help with this challenge of engaging with different vendors and helping get their data into the system, maybe through intermediary steps like Microsoft Forms or some kind of data upload, because you can't API and automate the process of every single one. So you got to query the right data that you need to your vendors. That data has to come to your system to then allow you to calculate all of their individual emissions in a standardized way across your different operations. And so that's the big challenge with Scope 3 is engagement with all the vendors. And we've seen that it's actually procurement and supply chain management teams that are tasked with that Scope 3 aspect.
Okay. And I think it's something that's it's often not talked about in terms of the actual vendors and stuff. It's often Scope 3 is often just more the like oil and gas going to a refinery, or going to an LNG facility and stuff. But you're absolutely right. Like the idea of the vendors and the folks as part of the supply chain that don't often have their own primary data on this, but need to collect that information. It is a huge challenge. So it's really cool to see that evolution in that conversation that you guys are really trying to help solve. So
Yeah. Like I guess on that point, regarding the upstream Scope 3 emissions, so like some of the earlier categories, like a focus in well operations, I feel that maybe oil and gas companies think that they can control those the most, that they can actively do something in terms of engaging with their vendors, putting into contracts requirements around reporting emissions to them, and then also making requirements to their vendors that they start to implement like lower carbon options into their Scope 3. And then that will make operators more comfortable to report the Scope 3 and maybe put net zero initiatives around it to allow them to show reductions on the Scope 3 side. So I think like around the vendor management side, they have more leverage there. They can also use it to negotiate with their vendors. If they've got vendors who they have data on that are higher emissions than others, that can influence contract negotiations between them. So I think that's the big drivers there on upstream Scope 3. For downstream Scope 3, we feel like most of the pressure comes in terms of whether companies are trying to offer like carbon neutral fuels or blue products like blue ammonia or blue hydrogen. And where in that instance, it's also important for them to have some kind of system that's quantifying those emissions from a site-to-site basis, being able to tie the emissions down to a carbon product footprint, and then allow them to deduct any offsets they have to show a carbon neutral distribution when they then export that gas to a different country. And that's becoming even pressures now, is where you have the EU regulations requiring by 2027 people that export gas to the EU to report the methane intensity. And so now you're having these regulations like crossing borders that impacts Trinidad and Tobago. It impacts West Africa exports as well, US exports, East Canada exports, and then also some other stuff that's coming up in Latin America too.
I think that cross-border piece, I think, has been something that I've been, talking a lot about, because I think it really has the ability or will potentially start to really impact this idea of differentiation of products, whether that's LNG or, like you said, like ammonia or, whatever chemical products it is, those end use products that are then being mostly put on the water and sent all over the world. Are you starting to see through the work you're doing, with the emissions management that, through the supply chain, so the allocated emissions to the products and stuff like that, that you're really starting to see that pull and that sharing of data because of this idea of, what that trading element's going to look like.
Yeah. No, we totally are. So I can tell you like from a marketing effort for the company, we constantly like go to the market with different ideas for solutions of how we could help operators. Since we've built a very configurable platform, it makes us easy to adapt it and move based on what the market needs. And so we started that effort with kind of going to market with OGMP 2.0, messaging and inquiries of whether having some kind of centralized solution to help with the entire OGMP 2.0 picture is a need. That was our number one engaged topic this year. We even won
Cool.
an award. Sally, our marketing lady who set up this conversation, she even won an award this year for that topic from like the Houston Business Society or whatever it was.
That's
Um,
awesome.
so yeah,
Shout
so
out to Sally, who
yeah,
does
yeah.
a great job in that space. So yeah.
Yeah. So we got so much engagement on OGMP 2.0. And then the next step from that is going to be around helping with the supply chain question for these EU regulations. That goes, and I think is most focused on LNG companies who are at the end of the line. They're the ones that are going to be selling the gas to someone across the pond. And they've got to give a number by 2027 on what that methane intensity is for their operations, but everything upstream of them that they don't actually touch. And so they're going to have to start requiring in contracts emissions from their upstream providers of gas, what those emissions were, or they're going to be put in a position to have to quantify the emissions themselves using some kind of upstream emission factors or methodologies. And so there's a lot of pressure on US LNG, Trinidad and Tobago LNG, as well as Nigerian LNG right now to start to look at how we're going to quantify those emissions to buyers and then put that into contracts to receive that data from others.
Yeah. And I think, like the countries that you mentioned, like they are the ones that are primarily delivering LNG into Europe. But we've also seen similar kind of conversations going on, particularly with Japan and some of the
Mm-hmm.
imports they're looking at as well. And so I think we will start to see this conversation a little bit more globally across the entire LNG supply chain as some of the major LNG importers are really kind of trying to understand what it means for them in terms of bringing LNG in and stuff like that. So it's definitely a conversation I think that not everybody is aware of, that it's going to, and how far then back through, like you said, it's going to, just because it's LNG, it will flow all the way back to the producers of the oil and gas in the first place and stuff. So it's definitely one of the things I've got my eye on that's going to really have a big impact, I think, in this market of around how companies really think about their emissions and what that looks like. So
Totally. Well, the
um,
interesting thing is, I think one of the dominant players in that space is going to be the IOCs. So, for example, you have Petronas. Petronas has gas fields in Canada, and then they're also building an LNG plant that's exporting out of British Columbia in partnership with Shell. Petronas and gas fields are feeding that LNG plant in Canada, in a closed loop, going through the LNG facility and then going right to their assets over in Asia Pacific region, where there's also those pressures around having lower carbon emissions and reporting those emissions. And there's also a huge market over there for like carbon neutral products. And so that's a huge thing going on over there. And I think these companies are becoming like more merged together, having more integrated supply chains to where it's easier for them to manage that rather than having different suppliers of gas to have to go through that whole process.
yeah. No, it makes sense, right? Because again, it's this whole data management piece of it. If it's your own company and your own supply chain, again, you can have more direct control over it and really make sure you can guarantee that the claims you're making as well around reduced emissions, low carbon offset, whatever that is. And so it'll be interesting to see how that space evolves as well. So
Totally. Yeah. We are actively pushing to be involved in that space. It's a very exciting thing for us to be able to provide like the kind of engine for calculating emissions across the entire value chain and having it like from the ground through to the point of sale and every step along the way is a challenge, and we're really excited to try to participate in that.
that's awesome. So, we talked about the fact that this year you guys have been super focused on the methane conversation and what's been going on with OGMP 2.0. There's so many
Mhm.
acronyms in this space.
Totally.
And we yeah, and we've started to, talk about sort of some of the things that are coming down with the trading kind of aspect of oil and gas. What else do you think people are, what do you think is coming down the pipeline? Like what are you guys kind of looking out for, and where do you think some of this carbon management and emissions reporting is really going.
Totally. I think I think we've touched on the top two things that are
Mm.
driving like engagement and need for digital solutions and data management around oil and gas. It's going to be that challenge around calculating carbon and methane intensity across the entire value chain, be able to display that to anyone along the way in a very automated way, and then tie it to the product itself as you're selling and exchanging hands. But then also the expansion of Scope 3 emissions reporting. That's going to continue to expand based on regulations, and more people are going to loop that into their process to report those as well. And then I would say a final thing actually on that is continued growth to more developing nations that aren't on the emissions journey yet. Most recently in India, which is a country we've been engaging in for the past 2 years. Vedanta, Cairn, it used to be Cairn, now merged into Vedanta, just joined OGMP 2.0. They're the first company in India to join OGMP 2.0. We're seeing expansion in Chile as well as in Mexico to join those initiatives. I think the EU regulations are pushing that drive for people. So there's going to be more countries that have not been tracking emissions at all today that are going to need help. And that's going to be not just a software platform. Just if a company hasn't been doing anything around emissions, like just giving them a software platform and saying have fun is not the way to do it. We're currently
No.
working in Chile with a very large company who is in that spot, and they didn't want just a software platform. They said we need to spend like 3 to 4 months on the front end mapping out all these emission sources, identifying how we're going to calculate emissions. If we're not going to do direct measurement right away, why not? What methodologies are we going to do? What's our LDAR plan over the next 3 years? You have to get all that in place, and then we can be like, okay, what data is available so that we can actually make a baseline calculation of emissions, get that into a centralized system, and then give you a process for calculating all your emissions for subsequent annual years.
I mean, I think it's you've summed up really nicely, I think, what I think we're seeing evolving almost as a separate discipline around carbon management, where, it's not just the one sustainability team that's, doing sort of the measurement and stuff like that. It really is this whole, management system that is being built into, companies and things like that, as these regulations and different external stakeholders are really requiring the data and understanding how this is evolving. So it's going to be I think it's going to be a really interesting space to keep an eye on as it grows as a discipline that doesn't really exist really right now. So
Yeah, and I would say that the bias is at this point is that so many companies have already established carbon management teams. Many of them been in place for over 10 years. It's just becoming a standard operating business procedure for any oil and gas company to, in some way, to some degree, track the emissions and report those to someone and have people dedicated to do it. Some people put more on it, some people put less. Some people are pursuing these initiatives where you can get large premiums on your carbon neutral fuels. That's probably a more variable, volatile space, but I guess we'll see what happens.
yeah. So any final thoughts before we close out today, Brian?
Yeah, no, I'd say the final thing, just kind of a point about Envana and with us is, I mentioned earlier in terms of people needing a company that's going to be with them over the next decade, that isn't going anywhere, that's like almost, a formidable person in the space. The startup Envana itself has been around for 2 years. In one sense, we're a startup in terms of the people that are involved, our pace, our innovation cycles, and our drive to make a difference. But on the other hand, we're very much still associated with one of the largest oilfield service companies in the world. The oil price could crash tomorrow and things could go downhill from carbon management, and we'll still be here to support our current customers and expand their solutions for emissions management. And so people that commit to us can expect a lot of stability in the solution and more of a partnership that can last several years to get a good system in place for them that they can continue to use.
Yeah, and we'll make sure we put the website and the contact information in the show notes for folks that want to follow up and have that conversation. So, yeah.
Brilliant.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a fascinating deep dive into the challenges that companies are facing around their emissions and their carbon accounting. So, thank you so much for joining me.
All right. I was glad to be here. Thanks for the conversation.